This chapter in healthcare ethics is concerned with looking toward the future, and there's quite a bit in this chapter on some different topics. So we've broken it down into two video lectures. The first one concerns what they call new considerations in ethics theory. Now, throughout the course, we've been actually looking mostly at traditional ethics approaches to solving problems and making decisions in healthcare ethics. We covered this initially in chapters 1 and 2, where we looked at ethical theories, and then we looked at the four main principles that are used in healthcare ethics. As we've seen, these approaches have focused mostly on the impartial application of principles. The idea of impartial is that we try to make the decision without having a bias one way or the other. And the text calls this approach principlism, so it's applying principles as we've seen. So we may say, well, how do we apply the principle of benevolence, which is that we should help the person, or the principle of justice, which, as we've seen, has procedural and distributive aspects to it. And so this is the principlistic approach, and it is very common, and it's the one that's most often taught in healthcare ethics. This chapter looks at two relatively newer models in healthcare ethics. And one is called the ethics of care. And we can see the word care in there, obviously. That is also in the word healthcare. So an ethics of care model stresses relationships and context in decision making. So it isn't as partial. The relationship you have to the person involved affects your decision making, and also the context in which everything is going on. So applying abstract principles to the case is not as easy, because there are a lot more details in the case, and every case differs in certain ways, and every person is a little bit different. So the principlistic approach focuses on a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to ethical decision making. Carol Gilligan was a psychologist who was researching ethical decision making, and this is a really interesting development in the history of psychology and ethical research, in that she found that there was a specific way of ethical reasoning that she found that women tended to use more often than men. Men were more comfortable with a rule-based, law-based, principlistic approach to ethics, whereas women tended to want to focus on the relationships amongst the people and the relationship of the person making the decision to the people, as well as certain other relationships and virtues that play a role here. And also there's a sensitivity to the context that seems to be missing a lot of times from the principlistic approach. And so one of the areas where you see this most often applied is in nursing, where you may think, well, the relationship between the people is of a certain caregiving sort, but moreover, nursing has traditionally been, as a profession, has been occupied by women. It's much less so now, but traditionally this was the role, and in a lot of ways the role played by a nurse was similar to the role actually played by a mother in a family. The virtues of character that are stressed here are empathy, the idea that you can put yourself in the position of the person you're trying to help and feel what they're feeling. Also compassion, where you feel, as similar to empathy, that you feel a connection to this person and you really feel strongly that you want to help them. So there's not this abstract application of principles. And then this connectedness, that you feel a personal relation with this person that is not just merely, let's say, if a judge were making a decision, and that's the sort of approach that the principlistic model follows, is sort of the judge making a decision impartially, whereas here there's the idea that there's a connection between the person who's the subject and the person who's actually making the ethical decision. Another new direction in ethics theory covered in this chapter is the narrative ethics model. And if you know what the word narrative means, which I assume you do, it has something to do with stories, with telling stories, but really more with listening to people's stories. This model has its origins actually in psychological research as well. Uh, the text mentions three tenets of narrative ethics. Like these are the things that structure the model here. First, every moral situation is unique, so no one universal principle applies. So you can see how the principlistic approach would not be the best one if this is true. Second, healthcare decisions can be justified given an individual's life story. So the idea is that the person's story plays a role, an important role in deciding what to do. So we need to know what their story is before we can make a decision. And finally, a dialogue for justifying a decision must be open and tensions explored. So we haven't decided what we're going to do until we've listened to the story and actually talked more about what the possibilities are. So the actual approach to solving the problem becomes part of the narrative itself. There's a narrative approach to psychological counseling, and so you might see how it might be similar to a sort of therapy in a way, talk therapy we call it. So if you wanted to be good at narrative ethics, the certain skills you would have, it wouldn't be the abstract application of principles that it would take to be a good principlist. And it is not necessarily caring, although you may think that caring would play a role as well. Why would you listen to someone's story if you didn't really care? So the first skill would be the ability to understand and interpret someone's story. So you have to understand what they're saying and figure out if they're not really saying everything maybe you think they should be saying, that you can figure out what it is they're trying to say. The ability to construct metaphors and recognize the bigger picture, that you could take their story and think of it possibly in terms of other stories or in larger stories that inform the human race and our human stories. So we have myths and legends and other kind of stories that aren't as grand, that help us understand our own and other people's lives and our place in it. The ability to be reflective, that you could listen to a story and not rush to judgment or make it in terms of your own story necessarily, but to reflect on it and to be able to process it. An ability to communicate with compassion. This we see a connection to the ethics of care model, so that there should be a compassionate approach, that the person understands that you really are listening and that you really care when they're telling you their story and when you're trying to reflect their story back to them so that they can understand it. So, how viable are these newer models? Well, a lot of people might say, well, these ethics of care and the narrative ethics model don't directly tell us what to do. Of course, people would say that about the principlistic approach as well. And you often have conflicts between different principles or different theories. And so again, you're left ultimately having to make a decision. But I would say that these would certainly be part of an ethics toolbox, the ability to listen to someone's story, to understand their story, to be compassionate, to have these ethics of care virtues, to understand the relatedness, to understand how important context is to ethical decision making, how the differences are often as important as the similarities when we're thinking about cases. So that concludes this video lecture, Looking Toward the Future, New Considerations in Ethics Theory. Cheers.